Okay, good morning, everybody. And we're going to carry on our discussion today about the nervous system, continuing where we left off last time, discussing the central nervous system. That's the brain and the spinal cord. We'll talk more about the peripheral nervous system in the last class, which we'll have on Monday, the last class of this nervous system part anyway. So I want to just remind you that I had showed you this before. You don't need to remember all the details that are in this slide, but I did want to remind you that in the center of the brain, there are 4 cavities, which are the cerebral ventricles, and they are filled with a fluid called cerebrospinal fluid. Cerebrospinal, because it circulates not only through the brain, through the cerebrum, etc., but through the spine as well. As you can see here, they are continuous with the spine here. Not only that, they're actually continuous with that space that in the meninges, in that the coverings, the synovial membranes that surround the brain are filled with fluid as well. That is also cerebrospinal fluid, and it circulates throughout. And the nourishing fluid, it contains nutrients, it contains oxygen, etc., etc. And it's essential that it keeps circulating. So I bring you back to the slides because I just want to point out to you that a useful way to think about the structure of the brain is that it is like a very complex tube. So we'll just think about it's easy to visualize it as a tube when you look at down at here at the midbrain portion here, and at the spinal cord. That's easy to visualize as a tube. When you get up here, just picture it as being a tube where at the end of the tube, the walls have become incredibly thick and they have folded over the rest of the tube. And that gives you a good idea about how the structure of the cerebral hemispheres is derived. It's like an enormous expansion at the end of that tube that has folded over the rest of the brain that lies underneath. And you'll see this much more clearly when we talk in a little while about the primitive brain that lies here at the center of the whole of the brain. So the brain, if you open the skull, the most obvious thing immediately are these cerebral hemispheres in the human. In most mammals, the cerebral hemispheres are large. If you go down to more primitive vertebrates, they are much, much smaller. And but as you look at the more advanced mammals, for example, the cerebral hemispheres become enormously enlarged, very, very complex. So we have, when you look at our skull, you'll see that we have 2 cerebral hemispheres, left hemisphere and a right hemisphere. Now, I include this diagram because you will often hear this referred to as the cerebral hemispheres kind of having separate roles. And you will often hear people say things like, I'm a left brain thinker, I'm a right brain thinker. What they mean is there is some distinction in the roles that the 2 hemispheres seem to play. The first thing to say is that there is a crossover. What I mean by that is the left hemisphere actually governs what happens on the right-hand side of the body. So that hemisphere governs that side of the body, the right-hand side. The left hemisphere governs the right hemisphere governs what happens to the left side of the body. So if there's damage to the left hemisphere, for example, something like a stroke or something like that, some brain impairment, it will make its effect on the opposite side of the body. The left receives sensory information from the right receives sensory information from the left, etc., etc. But there are other roles which are kind of accorded to these hemispheres. In general, the left hemisphere is considered to be more dominant in activities like speech, language, comprehension, that sort of thing, analysis, calculations. It seems to be where our sense of time lies, and also it allows us to put into correct sequence events and things like that. So one of the manifestations of disturbance of the left hemisphere, for example, is that people will mix up their words. They'll be able to say words, but they can't put them into correct order, that sort of thing. It also is damage to the left hemisphere seems to have a great effect on recognition of words, letters, numbers, but also recognition of faces and that sort of thing. The right hemisphere is the area of where our creativity lies. That is, I'm very reluctant to make too much of it, because in fact there is a tremendous amount of sharing between the hemispheres, but traditionally it's supposed to be associated with creativity, with spatial ability, that is, people, for instance, sportsmen, those who have good eye sense, this is where it lies. It lies in the right-hand hemisphere. And also, it is very important in recognition of faces, places, and objects. So, but I don't want to make too much of these roles. They are not rigid, and they are shared between the hemispheres. But these are traditionally, if damage occurs to one of the hemispheres, these are the areas where you'd see the most effect of that. So here are the cerebral hemispheres. You're looking at the left. We know that. I told you, because this is the front of the head would be here. The face would be here. We know that because here, look at this. That is the temporal lobe, and you can see it's pointing that way. And here is the cerebellum at the back. Here. This part of the brain here is called the brain stem, the midbrain, and it leads to the spinal cord, which is underneath, would be going off to the spine. You'll see that, in fact, the cerebral hemispheres are divided. If you look carefully, you'll see that there, for example, there is a very deep crease, and that is called a fissure, F-I-S-S-U-R-E, a fissure. These folds here are called the sulci, S-U-L-C-I, the sulci, or the sulci. The fissures, as here, divide the brain into lobes, into distinct lobes. It's not that clear when you just look at the brain, but if you were to be handling the brain, you would be able to see it much easier, because you could kind of separate the lobes at the fissures. And I'll just tell you quickly that there are more fissures. There's another one there. There's another one there, and there's one at the back here. So the cerebrum is divided into distinct lobes by these fissures. And those lobes have very definite activities associated with them. Damage to, we know a lot about this because any damage to these different lobes, which we can identify, has identifiable deficits that result from them. So if you damage an area, for example, which is responsible for motor movement, it may result in all sorts of disturbances of the voluntary muscles, anything from paralysis to epilepsy or things like that. So those, we'll see more about the function of the lobes in a minute. But those two lobes, the two cerebral hemispheres, so rather, actually communicate with one another extensively. This kind of communication between different areas of the brain is actually what constitutes kind of the computing power of the brain, is the fact that we have different areas of the brain talking to one another, processing different different things, sensations, etc., chattering to one another across the whole of the brain. That is what gives us the brain's power and also contributes to our consciousness and everything else. So the two halves, the two cerebral hemispheres, coordinate with one another largely through this band of tissue here. It's like an upside down C here. And that is called the corpus callosum. And it's a thick band of nerves which pass between the hemispheres so that they can communicate with one another. So there are some conditions where parts of the corpus callosum can be severed to stop that communication. And the one condition where this is done is in epilepsy which cannot be stopped, epilepsy which has become so constant that is actually a danger to life. And in those circumstances, on occasion, they will actually separate the two hemispheres, because what is happening is an epileptic seizure is beginning in one part of one hemisphere, and it is being communicated to the whole of the cerebrum and resulting in this recalcitrant epileptic seizure. And under those circumstances, they may surgically sever the corpus callosum. This has very distinct effects. So, for example, if you separate the eyes, for example, by doing that, you separate the function of the eyes, and you may find, for example, that a person may be able to see an object. If you cover the right eye, they may be able to see an object with the left eye, but be unable to tell you what it is until you uncover the right eye. When you uncover the right eye, they're able to tell you what the object is. That's an example. Okay, the brain, the hemispheres need to talk to one another to get a complete perception about what is happening. So for a little bit of extra credit, go look up, you can use any source of reference. You go to Wikipedia or whatever, it doesn't matter. Just go and find out, tell me something about the corpus callosum. And see what you can find out about the corpus callosum, and give me a couple of the effects of severing the corpus callosum. And that's for extra credit, 1%. Okay. So, and we have a quiz coming up, so you can hand it in on the week after the quiz, so you've got some time to do it. Okay, so let's have the fissures on the brain, divide the cerebrum rather, into these distinct lobes. And I want you to remember these, okay? And you'll remember I told you before that I wanted you to remember certain of the bones of the skull. Well, they're linked, the names are linked to those. So for example, here we have the frontal lobe here, there. We're going to see there's some different specific areas of these lobes that have particular responsibility. For the moment, just remember, try to get them into your head, if so to speak. The frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, the temporal lobe, there. Okay, so just those four: frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal. Remember, at the back, here's the cerebellum, completely separate from the cerebrum. And here's the brain stem and the midbrain there, running there. Remember what I told you? It's like a tube where the end of the tube has become swollen and folded over. And that gives you an idea of the derivation of that anatomy. So again, much of our knowledge about what happens in the brain, of the responsibilities of the different parts of the brain, is derived from people like Phineas Gage, who have suffered particular injuries to particular parts of the brain, which have then resulted in deficits. But we've also derived a lot of information actually from things like brain operations. Brain operations are very frequently done with the patient conscious, because there's no sensation of pain inside the brain. You don't need to be completely anesthetized very often for brain operations. And if during exposure of the brain, certain areas of the brain are stimulated, then it produces very particular sensations. You may stimulate something, and the person may see, as if in a dream, they may see the images in front of them as a vision area is stimulated. Stimulate a hearing area, they may hear things. So this is how one of the ways in which all of these functions have been elucidated. And nowadays, of course, examining the brain has become extremely sophisticated through imaging techniques like magnetic resonance imaging and this sort of thing. So we actually begin to get a very clear picture of the division of labor of these different functions around the different parts of the brain. This here is the frontal lobe there. And the first part to notice is this part at the back here, which is called the motor area. And this is where a lot of the control of voluntary muscle occurs. One of the reasons we know this, any damage here can result in paralysis, but also any damage here also can result in the development of epileptic seizures, called grand mal seizures, where voluntary muscles become involuntary. They involuntarily contract and relax very rapidly. This part here is actually called the frontal lobe. There it is there. This is all frontal lobe, but this here, sorry, is called the prefrontal cortex. And you don't need to remember that name. I'm only mentioning it to you because I wonder how many of you have read One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, because this area here features very prominently in that book, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, because this is a part of the brain where a lot of personality traits lie. So this is an area also where behavior is determined. This is an area of voluntary choice very often, but also of unconscious drives of personality. So this area has fascinated psychologists and psychiatrists, for example. And in the late 1950s, they developed this operation where if somebody was perceived to be having aberrant behaviors of all sorts, this became extremely popular, even to the extent that badly behaved teenagers and people would be subjected to a lobotomy. And this is what they did. They would actually sever the nerves in this area here. They would damage them so badly that area lost its ability to communicate with the rest of the body. This had very, very deleterious effects, which varied from person to person, but it was thought to be a way to control behavior and this sort of thing. So if you have time to do so, read One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. This is the area that you're particularly concerned with in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. This is also an area which should interest all of you, because this is where our ability to concentrate, to actually organize our thoughts, this is where they are. This is why psychiatrists, psychologists are so interested in this area, because disorders of thinking, attention deficit disorders, depression, all of these things it is thought that they may be linked to these areas here of the frontal lobe. Is there anything else I want to tell you about the frontal lobe? Yes. Just keep your eye on this, the Broca's area. I'm going to mention this in a while when I talk about coordination between areas. This is the temporal lobe here. There are many, many functions to the temporal lobe. But the most important, this is where most of our hearing ability lies. But interestingly enough, since it is associated with hearing, this is also an area where we deal with language. It's also very, very much involved with development of memory. Although memory is also driven from deep within the brain, from the primitive areas of the brain as well, the temporal lobe is very much involved. And you should be interested because this is also the area, one of the areas where the development of voluntary memory. It is the temporal lobe that becomes involved very strongly when we decide to memorize something. And I'll have a word about that in a minute as well. So the temporal lobe, hearing, language, memory, that sort of thing. Keep your eye on this part of the temporal lobe here, called Wernicke's area, okay, because I'm going to be talk about it again in a minute. The parietal lobe, this is where much of the information comes from the rest of the body to be analyzed for sensations and that sort of, but it's also involved with language. And this is also an area where all of our perceptions are organized. If you take something like a hallucinogenic drug, for example, it is functions of the parietal lobe become very, very disturbed. And we become unable to determine the nature of perceptions. Sensations coming into the brain may be inappropriately analyzed, for example. They may be sound may be analyzed as a sight, of this sort of thing. It's in the parietal lobe that our sense of the body lies. We have a very, even if you close your eyes, close your ears, whatever, we have a very strong sense of where our body is in space, and it's tremendously important for us as we literally physically make our way through space. The sense of body awareness lies here in the parietal lobe. The occipital lobe, right at the back here, that is where most of our vision processing takes place. Sensations perceived by the eye are actually relayed here to the occipital lobe to be analyzed. For the images that we see are actually made here, not in our eyes. The eye perceives the image, sends the information back to the occipital lobe, and it's the occipital lobe that creates the image that we actually see. I know it sounds strange, but that is actually true. If we damage the occipital lobe, a person may be perfectly able to see. We can test and see that they can, but they are unable to make an image. They're unable to resolve the information which the eyes are sending to them. So to ask you to remember a couple of places: Broca's area here, Wernicke's area here, there, and then also the parietal lobe. Just look there. I've asked you to remember those because it is this Broca's area is the area of speech control. That is where you physically make the motions which will create speech. It's Broca's area that helps you to do so. But it is these areas, Wernicke's area, for example, and the parietal lobe, that enable you to actually understand language. I'm pointing this out to show you, in order to, first of all, to speak comprehensibly, in order to understand what other people are saying to you, you are coordinating the activities of this area, other areas of the temporal lobe, Wernicke's area here, and the parietal lobe. So you have got information is being circulated amongst all of these areas in order for you to form language, speak comprehensibly, and understand what you are told. Damage to any one of those may leave the others intact. A person may be able to speak perfectly well, and yet not understand what they are saying, or have no comprehension of what they're saying. Damage to Wernicke's area, for example, damages, it doesn't hurt the hearing at all. People can hear perfectly well, but they're not able to understand what they are hearing. It is incomprehensible to them. It's just, I don't need you to understand in great detail. I just want you to realize that this is how the brain functions. It functions by talking across different areas of the brain. The processing of any, even a simple event, may take place in many different areas of the brain. The other things I will just point out on this diagram. First of all, there's the cerebellum, and we're going to talk about that again in a little while. Here is the bottom of the brain, which is the brain stem, and then up to the midbrain. It's under the end of that tube that I explained to you, that is folded over. We're going to look in a while to the very inside of the brain. This now leads down to the spinal cord. Okay, so here's the cerebellum at the back of the brain. Here, a large, extensively folded lobe of the brain here, and that is very largely concerned with things like balance and posture and orientation so that is what has always been attributed to it. But now some workers have discovered that there are actually elements of the function of the cerebellum which are also concerned with consciousness. And this is very interesting. This is new research that in fact the cerebellum may actually be coordinating with the cerebral hemispheres as well. But normally, if you are asked functions of the cerebellum, the main functions are control of balance. It's very much concerned with posture, muscle tone, and also with coordination of motion. This part of the brain here is the brain stem, and it consists of a part called the midbrain, then this part here called the pons, and then this part here called the medulla oblongata. And in those areas, these are places where all sorts of involuntary function of the body is controlled. For example, it's in this area that our breathing is controlled. We have a certain amount of voluntary control over our breathing. You can hold your breath for a certain length of time. But hold your breath now, and very soon you'll find that you begin to get a little bit anxious. And if you hold your breath in longer, it gets more and more until in the end you are overwhelmed with a need to breathe. All of that instruction is coming from the midbrain. Okay? It's all coming from this area because this area of the brain here is able to measure carbon dioxide in your blood. And that is what it's responding to. As the level of carbon dioxide rises in your blood, it sends out instructions to the rest of your body to start breathing faster in order to drop the amount of carbon dioxide in the blood. If you are in a system which is irretrievable, you cannot get away from increasing carbon dioxide, say you're trapped or something like that, this area will actually induce panic. As the carbon dioxide rises high, it will induce panic to get you to run away, try to run away from the situation. All of these are instinctual features which are lodged here. These areas also control your blood pressure and the many, many reflex actions. For example, if you look at a bright light, your pupils of your eyes will contract. Go into the dark and your pupils will expand. Those kind of reflex functions, those are controlled here as well. So, all of this you can consider the whole area here. These areas not a voluntary control, like the motor area of the cerebral hemispheres or the frontal lobe of the cerebral hemispheres. which are concerned with voluntary interaction with the environment. These are involuntary. They are receiving information from the body. All sorts of things are sending them information, and they are responding to keep the body in as optimal condition as possible. So at the very center of the brain lies what is regarded as being, is called the most primitive part of the brain. Very often it is referred to, for example, as being the reptile brain. The reason for that is, if we look at an actual reptile brain, it looks something like this. It actually looks something like this. And this lies in the center of the brain, is entirely covered by the cerebral hemispheres in human beings. And this is called the limbic system. And the limbic system is also of great interest to psychiatrists and psychologists, for the simple reason that it's the limbic system is an area which is concerned with emotion and with instinctual drives. It is in the limbic system that the sex drive originates. It's in the limbic system, for instance, that our sense of hunger is strongly lodged. It is an area which is concerned with unconscious desires, very, very strongly associated with emotion, with the development of the emotions, of expressed emotions like anger, that sort of thing. These seem to arise in the limbic system, but it is also very, very strongly associated with development of memory. And that's what I wanted to tell you in particular. Let's just have a look at the structure. Here's the corpus callosum around there. This part here is called the hippocampus, and this is called the amygdala. These are very strongly associated with development of memory. The other part we want to keep our eye on is this here, this part here, called the thalamus, and then below it, an area called the hypothalamus. Hypo below, thalamus above. So that's thalamus, hypothalamus, and then just remember amygdala and hippocampus. The amygdala and hippocampus are very strongly associated with development of memory, and they tend to determine what goes into short-term memory and is then lost right rapidly, and what goes into long-term memory. So you should be very interested, because you're trying to put new knowledge into long-term memory, right? So that it's you keep your memories at least long enough to complete your exams and things like that. But hopefully you're putting stuff into such long-term memory that you keep it for much of the rest of your life. It seems that if the limbic system decides that a piece of information is of emotional import, in fact, if a piece of information is of survival value, it's actually going to improve your chances of making your way through the world, the limbic system will decide, yes, it can go into long term. And the one way in which you can trick the limbic system into putting stuff into long-term storage is to repeat things. If you repeat them over and over and over again, even if you think you know something and you are bored to tears with repeating it, repeat it, because you'll trick your limbic system into shunting that information into long-term memory storage. Memory is a very, very, very complicated topic. We're not going to discuss it to any great degree, but just remember that one of the determining features is a piece of information useful for long term? Is it useful for survival of the organism? If it is, it gets kept. If it's not, it's only temporarily useful. We use it for the time we need it. It's gone. It gets lost. Okay, so this is the limbic system, very strongly associated with primitive drives, primitive, often unconscious drives. It is also an area, unfortunately, it seems that things like addictions, that sort of thing, are very strongly associated with the limbic system, because the limbic system is also an area which gives us our sense of reward. This is where the limbic system is where we get to give ourselves a pat on the back every now and again. And that becomes very, very important. It's a very powerful feeling that arises from the limbic system, of feeling good because you've done something. So the parts of the limbic system that we do need to really, I don't need you to know a lot of information about the rest, just some associated with emotions, with drives, that sort of thing. But we must pay attention to this, to the thalamus and the hypothalamus. And I'll explain why. First of all, the thalamus is like a relay station. The thalamus is where decisions are made, unconscious of course, about where information should go. Much of the sensory information gathered in the rest of the body is relayed first to the thalamus, and the thalamus sorts it out. The thalamus sorts sensation out and sends it to the correct areas. For example, it is the thalamus that gets all the information to those different areas of speech and language, or everything coming from your ears. That is sensation. It goes to the thalamus first, and the thalamus shunts it out for analysis to those different areas. The hypothalamus, below the thalamus, however, is also a coordination center, but it's our most important coordination center for the endocrine system. And we're going to talk a lot about how the hypothalamus actually receives information from the rest of the body and responds by getting the body to talk, different parts of the body to talk to one another by sending chemical messages known as hormones. And it's the hypothalamus that coordinates the endocrine system. So I'll only mention this because I know I see they do talk about it in the book. The two together, the hypothalamus and thalamus, are called the diencephalon. So let's just have a quick review of what we've seen so far. And I'll try and orient you by looking first of all at the bottom as of the brain, as the brain joins the spinal cord here. So here is this whole area is called the brain stem. And it is composed of, first of all, the thalamus and hypothalamus, thalamus, hypothalamus. The midbrain there. This swelling here called the pons. And then the medulla oblongata. Medulla oblongata ends there, and it goes to the spinal cord. Have a look at all of these, thalamus, hypothalamus, midbrain, pons, medulla oblongata. All of them have one overriding function, and that is sorting out where in the brain information has to go. These are all our relay stations. But so if you're asked, give me one function for the midbrain, you could say, okay, you could say processing of visual and auditory data. It's here in the midbrain that the sensations from the eyes and from the ears, a decision is made about where they have to go. That is actually relayed to the thalamus to be sent off. Look at the pons. What does it do? It relays sensory information to the cerebellum. It's getting information from the muscles and all that sort of thing. And it's sending that information to the cerebellum for control of balance and all the rest of it. So all of these, they all seem to have some role in relaying information to the correct destination. These are all areas of control, of coordination. And even the hypothalamus, although the hypothalamus is not relaying sensory information so much, the hypothalamus is receiving information, which it then sends instructions out to the endocrine system, to the hormonal system of the body, which is itself a control and coordinating system. So all of these, they're all concerned with instinctual control and coordination. The conscious functions are the responsibility of the cerebral hemispheres. Okay. And I think that is about all that I'm going to do with this diagram. Let me just check. Okay. So let's just have a look. We finish off our discussion by talking about the rest of the central nervous system, which is the spinal cord. So the brain now has to communicate with the rest of the body. We consider the brain to be cerebral hemispheres, the cerebellum, and then the brain stem. Below the brain stem, that is the spinal cord, and it runs through all of the vertebrae. And from the spinal cord, pairs of nerves run out to the rest of the body, which we'll talk about in our last class on the nervous system when we talk about the peripheral nervous system. So the spinal cord is actually part of the brain. It's an extension of the brain. And it still maintains that tubular structure. It has cerebrospinal fluid circulating through the middle and then around in the meninges, which also surround the spinal cord. And it gives off 31 pairs of spinal nerves. I just need to explain something to you. When you see this word nerve, it's very confusing. We say it gives off 31 spinal nerves. The spinal nerves are not individual neurons. They are bundles of neurons. And they're great big thick bundles. Here you can see they're actually surrounded by connective tissue. Here's the spinal cord here. Here's a bundle leaving here to emerge as a spinal nerve there. You see the swelling there? That is called a ganglion. And what a ganglion is, it's an area where a lot of the actual neurons synapse with one another and communicate and actually do processing there. There actually is processing of nerve impulses takes place here. So here is bundles of nerves leaving, and they form a single spinal nerve there, which goes out to the rest of the body. That spinal nerve, it depends where it is and what its function is, but it will, as I know this diagram is very complicated, but have a look here. You can see how they branch out into the rest of the body. We'll talk about them a little bit more in a while. Just remember, there are 31 pairs of spinal nerves. Now, I must also tell you that there's another set of nerves which we need to think about. And these are called the cranial nerves. And here you can see them all leaving here. And they come out directly from the brain. And you'll see that they are very largely concerned with reflex activities of the body of various sorts. For the moment, I'm going to end up here by telling you, all that you need to know for the moment is have a look, and you'll see that many, many, many of them are originating at that brain stem. You remember we said the brain stem is concerned with all sorts of instinctual responses like regulating blood pressure, regulating breathing, all of that, how wide your pupils are, etc., etc., etc. This is how they get their information, and this is how they communicate with those areas as well, is through these cranial nerves. So just remember the cranial nerves and the spinal nerves. That is the way that information is gathered from the body, and it's the way that the brain is going to send information. And okay, for the moment, I think that we can stop there, and I'll conclude our discussion of the nervous system on Monday when we talk about the autonomic nervous system.